Welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex,
meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations,
we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for women and girls.
We appreciate your company on this journey.
Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Red Light Exposé. My name is Andrea Heinz. I'm one of the co-hosts here at this survivor-led podcast, and I'm here with my co-host, Michelle Abel. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, good morning. So I'm Michelle Abel, and I am a member of Red Light Exposé, and I am also a survivor of familial trafficking, and I'm just really happy to be with these lovely ladies this morning.
Yeah, me too. So before we introduce them, just a disclaimer that we are presently in Manhattan, in New York City,
Yes.
in a hotel room. And so it is inevitable you will hear sirens and honking. I don't know what it is about New Yorkers, but they love their horns.
Yeah.
So I have been hearing them all night, and inevitably we'll hear them now. So apologies for that. But with no further ado, let's introduce our two lovely guests today, which both Michelle and I are so happy to interview. We've known them both for quite some time, and I know this has been a long overdue podcast recording. So Jeanne Sarson, our first guest, is a retired registered nurse from Salmon River, Nova Scotia, Canada, and is of Acadian Métis descent. She has a Bachelor of Science in Nursing and a Master's in Education. Jeanne spent several years working in the Canadian Arctic in Nunavik, Northwest Territories, and other northern communities before eventually returning to Nova Scotia. She has received the Excellence Award in Nursing Practice from the Nova Scotia College of Nurses, the International Relations Award from the Canadian Federation of University Women, and the Fearless Woman Award, which, this is really beautiful, one of her sons actually nominated her for. Jeanne is here today alongside her close friend and longtime colleague, Linda MacDonald. Linda is also a retired registered nurse from Nova Scotia. She has a Bachelor of Nursing degree and a Master's in Education. She is a member of the NGO Alliance on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, the National Council of Women Canada, and the Academic Council on the United Nations System. Together, Jeanne Sarson and Linda MacDonald founded Persons Against Non-State Torture in 1993, a self-funded independent campaign that raises awareness about and advocates for change around the issue of non-state torture, both in Canada and worldwide. They do this important work using relational feminism as their foundation, and as such have made tremendous strides in advancing women's voices and experiences over the past several decades of their tireless work. If you are in tune to what's going on in the space of violence against women and girls, you have certainly seen these two women out there championing the cause of equality and safety for us all. So thank you so much, Jeanne and Linda, for being here with Michelle and I today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle and Andrea.
Yes, thank you for the invitation. A lovely morning to spend with you.
Yeah, it is. Right now, for listeners, this is CSW happening in New York, which is why we are all here. So Linda, as the member of the Academic Council on the United Nations System, maybe you could give us a quick summary of what CSW is, because I know both you and Jeanne have been here numerous times, and Michelle, you've been here before, but this is my first time. I'm just a baby attendee. So maybe you can give us a quick summary before we dive into non-state torture about CSW.
Well, the CSW is the Commission on the Status of Women, and it was founded in the late 1940s after the Second World War, and is a commission that focuses on the human rights of women and girls. And we meet every year for a session for 2 weeks and discuss many different forms of human right violations that women and girls endure globally. And Jeanne and I we've been coming since 2004, and our focus is always on violence against women and girls, and in particular, non-state torture. So that's our focus. And we network with members of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, but that's what an NGO is, from all around the world.
That's impressive. I think before we hit record, you said how many women typically attend CSW. And do you remember what that number was?
Well, it's usually 2,000 to 3,000. But this year when we registered, I was told it was 14,000 that are here.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That speaks volumes of how important it is for women and girls to come together globally in, trying to raise awareness, make changes, important changes, and bring about important changes to benefit and safeguard women and children moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it's an excellent way just to unite women.
When we came in 2004, that's when we learned that we had to name non-state torture, because we came thinking that we would call it non-political torture, because we were struggling. Women were talking about torture, and we were struggling. What's the term, because the whole world just looked at state torture, meaning by police or military. And women and girls and children, if you were tortured, you were just tossed aside. You were just collateral damage. It didn't really matter whether you were tortured or not. I mean, violence itself against women was not really an issue until 1993. But Linda and I were here. We came all the first time thinking, oh, this is great. We're going to come with our little pamphlet. Remember, we sat down with the little pamphlet, non-political torture. The activists who have been here a long time looked at us and said, no, you can't do that. Everything is political.
So we knew that, though, but we just couldn't think of another word to stay away from the state. We knew everything's political as feminists.
So anyways, some of the activists said, you really have to look at the right term, find the right term. So Charlotte Bunch sent us over to Amnesty International and said they just had a recent pamphlet a few years before that around non-state actors, because that really wasn't even language in the UN, like state actors, which the actors just refers to an individual. And they said they just came out with this pamphlet on non-state actors. So you better go over and talk to them. So we ran across the street to the Amnesty International office, and they had 2 pamphlets left, little booklets left in their office. We grabbed those and we looked at that. We said, okay, now we have a term. We're going to invent the term non-state torture. So that's how it came about.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, I was going to ask the origin story of the name because, I think when people hear torture, they automatically, and like I've said in our book, Kathy King, and my book, When Men Buy Sex Who Really Pay, is where we graciously have a section donated by you guys, which is fabulous. Highly recommend you read it, listeners. In that part, we say, when we hear torture, we automatically think of the government official that takes somebody to the secret bunker in the government facility and waterboards them and does all these things to try to get information out of them. So we were saying this before we hit record, but language is really what helps people to contextualize things and make sense of them. So it's really interesting to hear, that it was also women that said, here's the best way to shape that term and how to place it in people's minds so that they can appreciate what it's actually about.
Yeah, because if we say women are tortured, people automatically go to war, that the women that are tortured in war or in conflict. They never, ever think of a woman being tortured in prostitution or in human trafficking or by families in a home. So when you put non-state on it, they have to think, well, what does that mean? So they'll ask us and then we explain it. Because otherwise we're just so conditioned to the patriarchal language of torture and that it never fits for women and girls. And that's just wrong, because women and girls have been tortured, non-state tortures, since millennial. It's just since the history of time that we've been tortured. So, and people would say, well, maybe you should pick a different name. It's a hard one. Nobody's heard of it before. But we'd say, well, that would be the same as saying, well, let's pick a different name than human trafficking or then rape or harassment. Those were all new words, and people eventually grew into them. So no, we're not changing the word. And we met a woman the other day, and she was talking about non-state torture. And so we said, yes, when we coined the word. And she said, you coined the word? Like, so it was so normalized to her, she never even thought of where it came from, and was shocked that it was a word we coined. It was kind of neat.
Yeah, every time I come here, I think about how important that little conversation was. It wasn't a prolonged conversation with these activists. It was just looking at us and saying, get with the program. So it was kind of fun. We had some laughs about it too.
It's hysterical because you don't know who Charlotte Bunch is, but she's kind of like the queen of the UN for human rights for women. And we'd heard of her, but we'd never met her. So this woman said, well, I'm taking you up to Charlotte because you can't be saying that, right?
Right.
So we went to the UN cafeteria, and Charlotte's sitting there with all these women as sort of like a organized conversation with a huge amount of people. So then this woman introduces us and sits us down, and Charlotte says, well, what would you want? So we told her, and she looked at us like we're two idiots, right? Oh my God, who are these two, right?
Yeah.
And then she said, you can't. So she said, I know the term non-state actors. Go and figure it out, right? So anyways, we talked to her a couple of years later, and she doesn't even remember that. But we told her how funny we thought that was, because we didn't get embarrassed or anything. We were just pleased that somebody gave us an option for which way to move.
And we were novice, because that was the first time. And we took our vacation time from work to come here for the whole 2 weeks so we could try to figure out how the system was working.
It was good.
They're looking at us. We're just novice here and thinking, okay, we're trying to make sense of this place. And anyway, that's how it happened. So every time we come here, that's kind of the root of the historical meeting for us and how it originated.
Well, it leads me to think, what sort of difficulties would you say that you faced in trying to be recognized and have non-state torture recognized? Because it seems, even though like you're sharing this about the UN and Charlotte, but I get the sense that there was a lot of pushback and perhaps negativity that you faced in trying to coin this term and have it recognized. So could you just maybe both of you explain what that looked like for you, even when you first started to come to the UN?
I can encapsulate it in what the phrase I coined is the titanium wall.
Yes.
I think we've
that
all
gives
felt
a
that,
really good impression.
Any feminist knows that, yeah.
They talk about the patriarchal wall and how it's a brick wall. Well, trying to get torture in through is like another titanium wall even to get through into the patriarchal brick wall. It's so huge. The taboo against women and girls being tortured is far beyond anything I've ever imagined ever in my life. People have told us that when they first heard us, they thought we were mentally ill. And they're honest because, they were women in high position too, and we're honest. They said, we really literally thought you were both mentally ill. And we figured that, but nobody would tell us. But that's the way they'd look at us. Or some people would literally run away from us. We're like, just literally run. I'm not exaggerating. Run. Or they try to accuse us of coming and stealing women's voices and not getting consent, even though we had written consent on every piece of document that we brought with us from the women. We've been accused of being incompetent in our nursing practice, that we're a risk to the whole community. That was one of the professional complaints against us, that we were, to our nursing association, that we're a risk to our whole community.
For speaking about non-state
the work
torture.
that we're doing,
Wow.
Yeah.
And do you think that that's just because it's just so heavy? Like, I can't remember if this is a Dworkin quote, but it says like trauma that is too much for people to bear, where it's just, that's the cause of the titanium wall? Or what do you think is the reason why people shut down so much when they hear it?
Well, for me, I've never shut up from, I was raised in violence and, I was sexually assaulted as a 5-year-old. So I never learned to shut up. And my mother always spoke the truth. It was never anything that nobody talked about. And as a student nurse, I remember the psychiatrist coming in and trying to convince me and the rest of the class that an alcoholic father had a disease. So I put my hand up and said, I totally disagree with you, because my father leaves the house. He doesn't beat up every female that he sees on the street. He only comes home and beats up my mother, so I can't agree with you that he's diseased. I guess I bring that in because I think part of it is not letting go of our roots, understanding who you are and what's important, and never being silenced, I think, is critical. When you're talking, Linda's talking about how people tried to silence us or change the language. And I think that's number one. I think that's buying into the perpetrators, because the non-state torturers, they want people to shut up. They want all the women and the children and the girls that they victimize to shut up. That's their, if you have a Bible of non-state torturers, that's number one. Never tell ever, ever, ever the truth. So I think over time, society has conditioned women never to speak up. And I think we have to resist that with every ounce of what we have. And that's why I brought in as a child. I think some of that conditioning not to tell starts very young, for
I
little
agree.
girls as well as for little boys, for children. Never tell on the family.
Absolutely.
Never, even during the Holocaust, the women who tried to tell about prostitution and their victimization. When they took their stories, they wanted the women not to tell about the sexualized violence that they endured. Be quiet. I think it has to be a key for us, and it has been for you and I, Linda, never to be shut up. Like Linda brought in 2 complaints we have, and actually we've written a little bit about them in the second book, which we've just finished, that the alleged perpetrators submitted these 2 complaints. But the important thing is to remember that it was women who submitted these complaints, and they were women who were perpetrators, alleged perpetrators. So if we're going to be insistent on respecting the voices of women who are saying to Linda and I that I was tortured, if we're going to respect the dignity of a woman who looks at us and say I was tortured, we cannot change her statement. We cannot look at her and say, oh, I heard you were abused. That's not what is being said. If a woman says to you, I was tortured, or I was prostituted, or I was whatever, that's what we have to hear, and that's what we have to repeat. But we knew in part that they were coming too, because Linda and I were very aware when the first woman came that we had to have a definition of what torture by private individuals was, because we knew that if we ever stepped out without a clear definition, that we would be vulnerable, and also the perpetrators would use it to dismiss the voices of the women who were speaking. So we had to have some clear grounding, and we worked really hard to get we call it the patriarchal divide model, because what we did is we did the research to try in 1993, when there was nothing about non-state after torture. We said, okay, what's the definition of torture? We thought we could probably just pull out a little journal and there it would be. But even for state torture, what we found out, there were pieces here in this journal and pieces here in the UN. So we took all what we could find and made a list of all what people were defining, what the UN was defining as torture. And then we took what the women were telling us was torture and put them side by side, so they're the same thing. It didn't matter. So that was the grounding, and that's where the patriarchal divide came in, the discrimination. So how can it be that because it's women and little girls mainly, and children that are being tortured, that we want to silence them and not speak the truth? That's fundamental discrimination, patriarchal discrimination. So we knew we couldn't step out, but even having that, it was important to have that, because it gave us, I guess, ethical grounding to say, okay, we know we've done enough research when the complaints came out to say, this is the meaning, this is what's happened. we have enough strength to say that women who are coming forward, that there's no reason to disbelieve them. There's every reason to believe them. So that gave us the strength to fight the complaints. Because the first woman that came to us and said I was tortured, we had to say to her, we have no idea how to help you because we
Yes.
never helped anybody recover from torture. I mean, we know about abuse, our own histories, but we know nothing about that. But we had a duty to do no harm.
Yes,
So the
absolutely.
duty to do no harm, that was part also of the patriarchal divide model, making sure that we were grounded in a solid definition.
We want to take a brief moment to thank you for your listenership. As an independent volunteer collective, our episodes are only made possible because of donations from people like you. Please visit our website, www.redlightexposé.com, and click the donate button. Your support is greatly appreciated. And now, back to the episode.
In my opinion, anyways, patriarchy is cemented in with violence against women. That's what holds it intact.
Yes.
All the other forms of human right violations are horrible, but the violence is the worst because it's the most destructive to our personhood. And that torture is the worst of the violence because abuse is about power and control. That's the goal of the perpetrator. But the goal of the torture is the destruction of the woman or the girl's sense of self. So once you're shattered, you're really not able to speak for yourself. You know, you have to have support to regroup and regather yourself and speak. So if patriarchy can keep us shattered, well, then they have dominance forever. And so it's like the torture or non-state torture is the linchpin of maintaining patriarchy. And I think that there's enough patriarchal men that know that, and they just don't want us to claim the word at all. It just
They don't
doesn't
want it to be changed.
no,
At
they
all.
don't want to
Yes.
see that we're allowed to say the word. We're not important enough for the word. And that just infuriates me, absolutely infuriates me. And that's why we're so adamant that we're not going to, we're just not going to stop talking about it. And like Jeanne said, I mean, I'm the same. I was 2 when I started talking about violence, about the violence that my father was very misogynistic and violent. And I just never stopped. And once we came across this crime, well, we thought once we started describing it, people would say, oh my, don't tell me that this is happening to women and girls. How can we help? That wasn't the key. We were told that people shouldn't have to hear the details of torture. Yeah, if we see a movie about state torture, they show the movie of what happens to a man. They're sitting in the chair, they're hooded, their water's poured on them, they're electric shocked. The whole thing it's a movie industry about torture now if you watch it. But to think that a woman would be in a hotel room, your head dumped in the toilet, and electric shocked with a stun gun, well, we don't want to show that.
Yeah.
We don't want to show that. We want to show some sexualized violence that's, that she's aroused. It's just so atrocious, the discrimination between the two. And they're both the exact same acts, just in a different place, the same tools, just in a different place, and the same suffering. So we list what happens in torture, and we encourage women to list what happens in non-state torture, not to be afraid of talking and telling their stories, because to expose the MO of the perpetrators is the only way we're really going to, I think, break the taboo.
Mhm.
And that's the resistance.
Yeah, and I remember whenever I first saw the model that showed, state torture, non-state torture with that patriarchal divide. Like as somebody who, only discovered your work about 5 years ago, I had no clue. I'd never heard the term non-state torture. So whenever I looked at it, I thought, okay, there's going to be really clear differences between these two things and what is non-state torture in comparison to state torture. And whenever I saw that, and I then just saw the only thing that was different was, like you said, the patriarchal divide, I was like, oh my gosh, like a light bulb clicked. And then you really do see that misogyny is really the only thing that is stopping people from recognizing this, acknowledging it, owning it, acting on it. Like it really, like you said, is the linchpin that is holding this all together. And, silencing women is just going to make it so that nothing changes. And I really appreciate that you guys named your book, one of your books, Women Unsilenced. Like that was just the most beautiful term for, a book title. And I thought,
I
wow,
agree.
like that That really, just like non-state
Speaks
torture.
volumes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. They're both just such powerful terms that once you actually, hear it and read it and put it all into context, it really has a lot of power to it. And I think that speaks a lot to the work that you have both done, and the reflection that you've done in looking at the language and looking at the stories from the women.
Yeah, we've spent hours, hours, hours and hours and hours and hours developing our theory so that women will be believed. That's our primary goal, and that eventually children will be prevented from having to endure such atrocities. And this week we went to the Canadian mission reception, and Bob Ray was there, the ambassador. So I went over and introduced myself, told him that Jeanne and I were from Nova Scotia and that we worked with the issue of non-state torture. And had he ever heard the term before? And he said, no, I never have. And I said, well, there's state torture and then there's non-state torture. Does that make sense to you? Yeah, it really does. It does. I said, good. So I said, so what we're saying is what happens to women and girls is non-state torture. And Canada doesn't have a law against that. He went right into, well, in Canada, we have legislation. And then he had to disappear very quickly
Yeah.
Yes.
because Canada doesn't want to change our law. They want to keep it as state-centric.
Well, we see that with a lot of things too, even the femicide, the push for femicide, which I
Yes.
know you're both heavily involved in too. And
Yeah.
And we're not seeing that come about
No.
either. It's like, I don't understand how it's 2025 and we claim to have, this awareness and this heart for equality and human rights in general, but we're not assigning that in equal weight to the women and girls.
And we're
It's like,
supposed to have a feminist government.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
exactly. Yeah. But everything that we see is the opposite, isn't it? And truthfully, we're still being silenced in 2025.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important what you said, Jeanne, about not changing the stories that the women come and speak. And as survivors here in this room, I applaud you both for the efforts and the passion that you have. And it just emanates in your work and the way you speak. And again, these terms that we have, there's language around that people, I'm not picking on men, but I think men in power, like in our government, they just can't wrap their heads around it, or there's a pushback and a refusal at the same time to really implement laws that will ensure the protections of women and children in our country. And like Andrea said, it's still hard to fathom why. And I think that's the biggest question that we all must have in our minds when we read articles of femicide and the violence that's happening rampantly throughout our provinces. Like, what is it going to take? Where are we going to end up as women, as our children, as we're trying to protect our youths and children coming up? What do you think that picture looks like moving forward? How can we bring about the right changes?
Well, I think it's lack of political will for sure. We have a huge amount. Jeanne and I have gone to the Status of Women committees 3 times, and we meet the same resistance. So you can feel the lack of political will, when you start being activists in the political process. And so we just have to put enough pressure on them till eventually they realize they have to do something. We have to make it so that they'd have no choice. And I'm not really sure how we're going to do that yet, whether we're going to have an all-out strike in Canada and women just go on strike for a week and not do anything. Eventually, it's going to have to come to something, because we shouldn't have to be coming to the UN every year and asking to be treated as equal citizens on this earth. It shouldn't have to be done anymore. We have a huge rise in corruption in the world and pushing back in democracy. So it's making all of our rights much more vulnerable. So it's a very transformative time. The research shows that in times of crisis, it's also a time of opportunity. So if we could just find our way through all this to keep standing, I have hope that we'll move to a better place. We've made such strides. That's why we're getting such a backlash. And we just have to hold the fort until we walk through the door. But that's the way I see it anyways. Enough of us have to just keep pushing and speaking about it and saying we're not going to take it anymore.
like when you think back to just starting out, you must feel like there's been some progress that you've seen where people are starting to listen. And do you find that there is a gender difference there with men being more resistive and women being more sympathetic? Or do you find it's maybe the opposite because it's too real for women? Like, do you notice any difference between the sexes in the pushback to your work?
We have much more support today than we ever had, because I got an email on Facebook yesterday, and the woman used the term NST. Linda and I often talked. I said to Linda, when we see people using NST, we have to kind of think of that as a little positive, because it's like she didn't have to say non-state torture. She just used the
acronym,
NST,
yes.
the acronym. So I agree with Linda. I'm not sure how it's going to take the brain changes, because it is a brain change. And I think what's helpful is to know what the enemy is, and it is patriarchy. It doesn't matter who we are, we've all been affected by it. I know that's kind of the enemy, is how to break down patriarchy. Patriarchy is very solid, I mean, it can be a Canadian issue, but it's a global issue too.
Yeah.
Canada is here,
Yes.
and they're influenced by what they put in the outcome document, by the negotiations. And they're deleting things like equality and feminism can't be included, so I think the everyday person forgets that what happens at the UN also impacts nationally, because Canada goes back with the outcome document from here, takes it back to Canada. And if it hasn't progressed, in some ways, Canada can just toss it aside. And there's different ways that happens. It happens this way, but Linda and I, they'll say to us, if you're an NGO, you can send in a document to, say, the Committee Against Torture, I'll use that. And we sent 2 shadow reports into the Committee Against Torture in Geneva. And what shadow reports are what you as an individual or as a group think is going on in your country, which can be very different than what the politicians are writing in their report.
Yeah.
So we decided in 2012 to write a shadow report, because we were a member of a non-government organization, and they had a resolution on non-state torture. So in 2012, the experts on the committee agreed with us and suggested to Canada that they change their national criminal code to include torture by private individuals. So that's all they could do, and that would be legal. So what Canada did, Linda had emailed them.
Well, we talked to her in the hall.
I talked to her.
Got her in the hall.
Yeah.
Corner her.
Yeah.
You ain't getting away.
Yeah. And she sent us an email and saying, well, it's very nice that the committee said this, but a general recommendation, it's a soft law. It's not legally binding, so go away. So that was very easy to do. So then we thought, well, that was our first experience in 2012 with a committee that was really supportive. So we thought we'd try it again in 2018, because every country that's a member of the UN has to go every 5 years approximately to submit to the Committee Against Torture what they're doing in their country about the issue of torture. So we thought we'd go back again, and we took another shadow report independently. And really, we were told we didn't fit. It's like, go away. I'm still insulted by that, and made a complaint in Geneva that we felt that was wrong. Nothing happened. That's the patriarchy. It's not to be hurt by it, but to be pissed off by it.
Yes.
Like, this is wrong. We're trying to get equality there. And what always comes to me is the statement by one Canadian. He was at the mission in Geneva, and Linda and I were trying to get them to think differently. He looked at us and said, what difference does it make if a baby is tortured? They will grow up and forget about it.
Oh,
That was
It's
his
shocking.
Yeah, that was his response. And we could say, no, that's not right.
I said it makes a lot of difference to the
Yeah.
baby.
mhm.
Yes.
I'm only sharing that because that's the thinking. And then I go back to the statement that Linda one day, she was listening to the holy men from another country. And he said, Well, women are just really like animals, but they're disguised to look like humans so that we won't be frightened of them. So that's the total objectification. And even though his statement comes from another country, it influences what happens here at the UN. It influences what Canada takes back from the UN, so it's to understand the whole circle of patriarchy and how it influences all of us in this room as for women, how it influences the victimization that women survive and have to struggle to have equality recognized. It's a global and it's national. Understanding what the enemy is, I think for me, keeps me from being hurt, taking it personal, because it's an evolutionary process that we're going through globally and even nationally. I just know that that's the fight we have.
Yeah, to answer your question more particularly, we've had a lot of support from men, actually more support for men, especially in the beginning, and probably because they're not the victims in the crime, right? But they were willing to open the door for us. It was a male editor who gave us the first opportunity to publish an article because he said he knew that there was many of these perpetrators in prison. He knew that from the work he had done, so he gave us the door. That was a big break.
Yeah, that was, yeah.
And John Winterdyke, who was a professor in Calgary, he's very, very supportive of our work, and he gave us the opportunity to speak in Spain and to publish an article, and he's always promoting our work in different places and asking how we can help and to teach his students. So they're examples of two men, but there's been many others, and some women, but not as many women, not really as many women. We've had more women try to stop us than help us. Young women, not so much. Young people are it makes sense to them right away because they haven't been conditioned long enough to think that, torture only applies to men. They haven't been. So they come quite quickly, and they're shocked to find out we have a law against state torture in our country. It's specifically written for state torture. Obviously, that's the discrimination, and all they'd have to do is just expand it by 2 words, maybe. And they're shocked to find that out, that they're living in a country that denies that.
Well, and I think too, like once you become somebody doing feminist work on the front lines and you're kind of leading change, I think I probably speak for all of us when I say it almost feels like you're living in 2 different worlds. Like,
Yes,
absolutely.
absolutely.
Yeah, like, your world, your reality, and then you're seeing the rest of the world. And there's certain people in the rest of the world that you identify and you're like, oh, you're one of us,
Yes.
you
Yeah.
get it,
That's
you
right.
understand. But
Yeah.
it's almost like this blinded existence that people operate in. And, I look back, obviously as somebody who bought into sex work ideology very deeply, I was one of those people for so long. And then it's almost like a catalyst happens that awakens you. And then all of a sudden there's no going back. And everything becomes very real. And you see how divided society is on that topic that you're now awakened to. I think that that's the challenge probably. I've had people say to me, like, how do you go on every day and know the things that you know and fight for what you fight for and not get upset about the hate that comes your way? And I always say, because I know I'm on the right side. I think when we've all been asleep, for lack of better terms, and then we awaken, we've been in both of those places. So it's a lot easier to understand somebody who has not had the awakening and has not been in both those spaces as to why they cannot understand the awakened perspective. So yeah, it's like what you said, Jeanne, about like, it's not about being hurt, but it kind of does hurt because you're like, why are you not seeing this? Why can you not empathize? But it all comes back to that moment of awakening, I think.
And I think it's so important to, like what you just said, Linda, about not having the support from our women. And I can't understand that. And yes, I can understand about not being awake enough to embrace what's happening. But as women, like we were talking before we started recording, we're just natural nurturers. We come together, we unite, we want to see changes, and it's natural for us to support each other. But yet, in this abolitionist movement, we're not seeing that so much. And I think it's been such a fight down. And we've all experienced women just trying to silence us and push us down. And it's been these handful of really great men that have been supportive or opening doors, like you said, with John and the reporter or editor. And I'd really like to understand, like, what is your sense in that truly? Why do you think we have so many women leaders trying to silence us when
Well-
they should be supporting us?
Well, we have a lot of men leaders that don't too.
No,
Let's
no,
say that
I
for
recognize
yeah.
that, right?
I'm not
We
saying
talked
that
about
all men-
patriarchy,
Yeah.
but on this note that you ended with, I'd really
Sure.
like to understand, why do you think this is happening?
Yeah, I think it's a myth that all women are nurturers. The same as this-
Really?
Yeah, I do
Ah,
believe that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, yes, because we have female perpetrators,
Right.
which many people don't want to recognize that.
I think
and
there's-
that's unfortunate.
I think patriarchy perpetrates a lot of myths to keep us in place, right? And I think that you've got the oppressed group behavior of women who
Yes.
don't understand feminism at all. They've not even thought about the theory of feminism or that we're dominated or oppressed. So there's those group of women. And I don't think they're deliberately doing anything. I think they're just following the conditioning, like you followed the conditioning of sex work, which became so dominant in universities and really is a tragedy to young women.
Yes.
But then there's a group of women who are feminists, who understand the theory, and they are not oppressed, in my opinion. And I know many feminists will disagree with me, but that's just the way it is. There are just some feminists who are willfully holding women back, and that's why I coined the term femi-misogyny. And I think that's a race for power, the same it is for men who want that power, who are in the patriarchy. I think it's a disservice to all of us.
All of us.
Yeah, I really
Yeah.
do.
I have to agree. And I think we all agree in this room. Yeah. It's mind boggling for me. Why would you do that when we need your voice and we need you to speak up with us and simply stand with us? We're not needing validation because we all know what we went through, but we just need that support to maybe just feel united. That's what we're after.
It's almost like a commercialized feminism where they're it's competing with each other for who's going to be the
Yes.
most at something, and that's
Yeah.
not the way
It
feminism
shouldn't. It shouldn't
be.
have competition
No,
in this.
No, because we need all of us, really.
Yeah.
So I agree with Jeanne. I used to get terribly hurt, really, really hurt, but I don't get hurt anymore. I've had so many blows that you just learn to finally get the theory that no, this is not personal. They're not doing it to me. I mean, they're directing it at me personally, but they just want to maintain their power. So I don't take it personal. I don't get hurt. And I don't worry about the backlash either because I've been getting backlash my whole life, even from the time I was a child in my family for speaking out. So
Yes.
there comes a point you have to learn that it's not really about you, it's about the silencing. So I focus more on, especially now that I have the name Feminine Misogyny, it really settled it for me in my mind and in my spirit to kind of move on. And I hope it does for other women if they use the word and it helps them. I'm hoping that will help them. Because you know how naming settles your mind, you know, you have less emotion around it, less confusion about it. So I'm focused more on like you women who are working with us. And I'm hoping, could I ask just a question or does that seem?
No, yeah.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. So for you, when you heard the word non-state torture, what was your response at first? Was there some resistance to whether it applied to you or whether it would fit for women, or how was it for you when you first started thinking about it?
Well, I think as I said in Kathy King in my book, is it made everything make sense because I know a lot of the work that you guys have done has been based upon a questionnaire as well too that you've administered to women that say, you know, have you experienced this? And I remember, I think it was you, Linda, that said, would you like to fill out our questionnaire? And you know, we're just trying to get some information and data together. And I said, sure. And in my mind, I thought, oh, there'll probably be like two things, you know, like I was in a fancy brothel. I was not trafficked. I was not tortured in my mind. But I think as I was going through it, it was like check. How many numbers?
49.
Yeah, and I think I had almost half of them, and that was shocking to me, and I thought, "Oh my gosh," I thought maybe again there'd be just a couple, but for there to be half, that was really alarming, and for me, it I think contextualized that debunking of sex work ideology more in my mind because it was like, "Wow, okay, there isn't this divide even in the prostitution system of the woman that has a good experience and the woman that has a bad experience." So when people say like privileged, you were privileged in prostitution, I still battle with that too, because yes, I wasn't trafficked. Yes, I was in a fancier, cleaner brothel at some points of my exploitation. But is any woman who's in a prostitution system actually a privileged woman? Like, can you actually even assign that kind of word to anyone who's in a system of abuse? So going through that checklist really helped me to unpack a lot of stuff and think all those moments where I thought that I was just assaulted or that I had faced some kind of abuse, to see it categorized as something that is applied to somebody being tortured by a state actor, it really, as I said in the book, and I'm reiterating here, it really helped me find some measure of peace within myself to have that, like you said, Linda, new language that helped to frame my experience. So it didn't take me aback in any kind of way. It really helped me and gave me some form of healing. So, I've been grateful for your work because of that, especially
That's
on a
what it's
personal
all
level.
about for us,
Yeah.
the healing. Yeah.
Absolutely. And for me, because of my childhood abuse, and I was tortured, I really needed to wrap my head around it. Like, is this applicable to me? I was a child victim. So, does that mean I fit into it? So, I was trying to measure, where do I fit in? And I don't think I did your checklist, but just knowing enough about your work and being aware of that, I did initially struggle to find, am I fitting into this? Or is this only applicable outside of this familial trafficking, family violence dynamic? So it took me a while, but it's like you say, violence is violence, and violence was inflicted, whether it's when you're a young child or when you're older. So it was sort of like an epiphany. Oh, yeah, I do fit in. Yes, this is relevant to my experiences.
Well, and I think too, the thing is that we're always told, you're not a victim. You don't speak for all women. Nobody did you wrong in any kind of way. There's all that victim blaming that happens to women and girls, children who have experienced any kind of sexual abuse, familial abuse. So I think there's also that natural hesitation to say, I identify with this, because again, the power of that word torture carries so much weight that you don't want to take something from people that you feel is not something that is relevant to you in your situation, because then, someone's going to say, oh, you weren't tortured. It's just another accusation for them to throw at you.
Yes. And also, I think many of us, and I certainly did it with coming out and coming forward and being public about my abuse, is, oh, well, worse happened to Jeanne, or worse happened to Linda. And so I'm not important enough, or my experiences, well, I have more empathy or sympathy to Jeanne because she went through this for a longer duration. I think it's important too for us to come out of that mindset and just know that what happened to us was absolutely wrong. And yes, we do have a voice. Yes, we can be validated. And yes, we can fit into certain terminology, and it is going to be applicable to what happened to us. And we can own that and not feel embarrassed or silenced or ashamed of what happened to us in our existence so far on this earth.
So what I'm hearing is that now that you both have the right to use the word torture.
Absolutely.
You see, and that's the issue, is like women were taught we're not good enough. And we have every bit of right, if you were a torture survivor, to claim that word, because it's a powerful word.
Yes.
And you have right to that power of that word, to use it to claim what happened to you.
I think the internalized shame is so strong in women who have experienced any kind of abuse because of the external victim blaming, but also, the people who abused you directly dismissing what they were doing and blaming you. So there's like the three levels of it, your own internalized shame, your abuser's shame that was levied against you, and then the public's dismissal that comes into you as shame. So,
And the judgment,
yeah.
the absolute judgment that comes in doing this work. And we're all public. And so they get to put a face, but they also feel that they can judge us according to the experiences that we've had.
And the experiences that we've shared. Right? Because they think they know everything about our story. Like there's so many things that we read.
We leave out and purposely, because again, there is that internal shame that still continues. And I say it doesn't matter at times how healed we are, what that journey looks like. Sometimes it just takes one person to make a certain comment, or we see something written about us, and we're right back to that place of shame, internal shame, and put down.
One of the solutions for that, in my opinion, is the responsibility to name the MO of the perpetrators. That means to be able to expose the perpetrators and what they do. Because if we don't say, okay, that perpetrator, what he likes to do is to make sure that he causes every person, every young girl or every woman that he tortures, non-state tortures, to feel ashamed. That's his MO, to make sure that he does that, to make sure that he does a great job of making sure that those he's torturing believe that they are responsible for what's happening to them. His MO is to make sure that he finds a way to make sure that your belief system is that it is your fault, to make sure that his MO is that you've done something wrong, and this is so-called punishment if you're a child. We really have to expose the MO, because that starts holding them accountable and it starts exposing them. And that means we don't apologize. We're not going to apologize for the torturer, say we don't want to expose his MO. Of course we do. We want to expose that they have pleasure. They have pleasure in the destruction. We have to name the pleasure. Linda and I have been talking about this because people keep telling us, well, we never thought of the pleasure. Well, of course they have pleasure. That's what they're doing while they're doing. Mm-hmm. But we have to break that down. So we started making a list. So they have pleasure seeing the terror in your eyes. They have pleasure seeing the shame that you have. They damn well know that they're humiliating you. They know that stuff. But we have to name it so that we expose them. We know that they're doing this intentionally. This is not an accident. Their MO is intentional. They have pleasure in creating the shame. They have pleasure in seeing the terror in those they victimize. They have pleasure in seeing the person bleeding, the woman or the girl bleeding. They have pleasure in forcing the woman or the girl to self-harm. They have pleasure in all of these things. And I think we really have to put it there. Linda and I started there. That's why the model of patriarchal divide started. These are acts that they do, but we have to break it down because the system has not really dealt with pleasure. Even for the state torturers, they haven't gone to the fact that men holding other perpetrators of torture accountable for the pleasure that they have in destroying another human being. That is their MO, and we have to speak clearly about that and never apologize for exposing the MO of the perpetrator. So never apologize for speaking the truth, as far as I'm concerned.
We don't.
We don't.
Exactly. We're not apologizing for the message we're bringing here today. If you're upset about it, that's your issue. It's not ours.
Yeah.
This is the truth.
You're very clear about that.
And we have to call it the MO. This is the MO of the perpetrators, folks. This is what we're exposing. Because so much of the concentration is on the woman or the girl who's been victimized, which is important. But if we just focus there, the perpetrators get away. They're not pulled into the victimization. This is a crime. So who committed the crime? You have to acknowledge the victimization is a crime. You can have trauma, but trauma doesn't only occur with victimization. You don't have to be victimized to have trauma. If your house burns down, you have trauma. If you have an accident, you have trauma. There's no victimization there. You have a traumatic response. But when you say victimization, there's a crime that's been committed. We don't hesitate to say, okay, I'm a thief. What are the tools of the thief? I have to break the glass, or I have to have gloves so I don't get cut, or I have to have instruments that maybe I can unlock the door.
There's a checklist,
Yeah,
in other words, but there's no checklist for the abuse that's inflicted. Yes.
So we have to make them visible, because here again, it goes back, they're hoping that we never say a thing.
Well, I think that patriarchy has created the perfect crime in prostitution, right? They've tricked the general population to believe that it's empowerment, that it's work, that women consent because we get paid for it. It's just a perfect crime. And it was brilliant for the Swedish women to really bring in the Nordic model and shift onto the demand. But what I think our work does for any women that validate for themselves that they have a right to claim that they were tortured in prostitution is that there is no consent. Legally, you cannot consent to torture. You just cannot. Globally, we recognize that. So it doesn't matter whether the woman gets money, whether she's in a brothel, whether she's in a hotel room that she rents herself, whether she's on a video cam. If she's being tortured, she cannot consent to that. It's not work. Torture is not work. And it's just infuriating to me that we're still having these conversations in 2025, because we know now if a little girl was tortured in her bedroom, that's a crime, right? Not everybody will agree that it happened because they're still blaming or whatever. But once it's been proven that she was tortured in her bedroom, that's a crime. We know that a woman being held captive somewhere, she's been kidnapped, we know that's a crime. But if a woman walks into a hotel room and takes money from a man, and in the process, he, strangles her, he electric shocks her, he does whatever torment he has pleasure with, we don't see that as a crime. I mean, that is just ludicrous.
Yeah.
Really ludicrous. I found out that my great-great-grandmother was in prostitution in 1845 in a so-called tavern. Now, well, in 1845, every tavern would be a brothel, right? And she threatened to hang herself unless her buyer, my great-great-grandfather, would marry her. And he did marry her. And they ended up apparently having a good relationship. He was probably a good man. But to know that she died never having known that this time has come when it's a crime, and it is a crime in our country, and yet we're still not getting the convictions that we want, in Canada. We don't have the stings that we should have. We don't have the demand exposed the way it is. But at least we're moving in that direction of saying this is a crime. Because little girls shouldn't have to grow up, and little boys either. We shouldn't have to grow up in a world that thinks that it's okay to buy a person. You're not buying an act, you're buying a person. For that hour or half hour or 3 hours or 2 days, you're buying everything about them for that moment in time. And that's dehumanizing, and it's a crime. And we should see it that way. It's very dehumanizing.
Yeah, I agree 100%. The dissociation that is so inherent to commercialized sexual exploitation is so hard for people to understand and wrap their head around. And again, this is another conversation we were having before we hit record, was, just using the term sex buyer and talking about like the sex trade and stuff like that, and how people equate sex instantly in their minds to the type of sex that they have probably been fortunate enough to have, which is consenting and not having any involvement with a coercive measure being introduced to it and stuff like that. So I think for people to really switch their mind to understanding how different prostitution, quote unquote, sex is to everyday consensual mutual sex that you want to have with somebody is day and night. And then whenever we silence the women to not come forth with those stories, or when they do, we shame them and try to kind of distort whatever they're bringing forth as their truth, we're doing an even bigger disservice of this public awareness raising. I really struggle with that when people try to say, like, and that's what I see on my Twitter all the time. She consented, you consented, everybody consented. And when you even talk about really graphic things that we would allow these men to do, I should say, to us, because we were so in need of money. And people say, well, I go to my job, and I don't like doing whatever I do, but you still consented. You could have left. You could have walked out. There's no appreciation for constrained agency and the plight of women in that economic and social context where we are struggling to just make it in the world and be treated fairly, have our human rights recognized, make an equal living to men financially where we can live on our own without having to partner with them. And sometimes they're the abusers. Like, there's really very limited opportunities for women to be completely autonomous and independent in their lives and not have to be around men who are taking advantage of that marginalization that we face. Yeah, it's great that we have the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, but I agree, like, it's almost like it's dead on the books. I don't know what it's going to take for us to move that forward. And now, 11 years into the law, we're now at risk of losing it because we have so much pushback from, like you said, Michelle, the women who have been conditioned to believe that this is their right, that this is employment, that it's a job like any other, and how dare you tell me what to do with my body. It's all these distortions of things like bodily autonomy and choice, and it's being levied against the most marginalized women who are living it and then later coming forth and sharing those stories with courage.
And I think this, we know from research that stories change people's minds. And in history, that's how humans communicate. So I think the stories of torture, I think the more women that can break the wall of shame and say, to hell with you, I'm going to tell exactly what happened, the worst things that happened to me, and start exposing that in Canada. I do believe that will make a difference. I really do.
I think, Andrea, what you just said was an example of what I was just talking about the MO, because you were describing all about the women. Nobody was saying, okay, what are the men doing?
Yeah.
They're not saying to you, would you please describe to me what the men are doing that caused you to disassociate? They caused you to disassociate, but that's not what they're asking. They're questioning, why would you disassociate?
Yeah.
So that's a very different mindset. It should be saying, okay, what are the men doing for their pleasure that causes that consequence? So that's why I think exposing the MO of the perpetrators is so essential. And I go back to 1948 and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, like it's one of the most translated documents on the planet. Like, I think there's like 577 maybe different dialects and languages that it's translated into.
Wow.
And in 1948, when it was released as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there were women involved who said that they started a revolution because they rewrote articles in the Universal Declaration, and Article 5 reads that no one shall be subjected to torture. At one time, it was no men shall be subjected to torture, but they said they were conscious of starting the revolution, and we're still in that revolution. I think we're forgetting that this has been going on 77 years. We're still in that revolution. I think it's important that we give ourselves credit that we're still fighting the revolution, because they wanted us to hold ourselves in a place of equality. Like Article 1 says, we're born equal. We're born to have the full articles in this document entitled to us. So that's the revolution. It's to say we had the right. In 1948, we were granted the right to speak about the torture, to claim we had that human right, never to be subjected to torture. And we're asking the world to respect that. But just to let us all know that we're part of that revolution that just has never finished yet. That's important to me. And we wrote in the second book a lot about the revolution, because maybe it will give us some stamina to know that it is a revolution that we're talking about. We're still here, it's 2025, and we're still saying that we had the right that the women granted us in 1948 not to be subjected to torture, to have the right to our dignity, have the right to be respected, have the right to claim that right, never to be subjected to torture, and there should never be any excuse from women or from men for us to have to justify why we're claiming that right. That's important to me around the issue of caring, how to self-care is never to apologize because we've been granted that right. And other women started that revolution for us.
Yeah. So your second book is called Healing, and maybe that's a good segue into talking about healing from non-state torture. So I think whenever somebody hears the term torture, they think like that's the end of that person completely, right? There's no further injustice that they can ever experience in being tortured. That's, like you guys already said, the destruction of the person to the fullest degree. Probably, and I'm assuming this is just, again, an assumption, that there's a balance to be made between recognizing the severity of it, but also leaving women with hope that there is the chance to heal. And I know that we've talked about this on Red Light Exposé, that, we don't want to come on here and just trauma dump to people and be like, okay, thanks for listening to all this horrible stuff. Bye. See you in 2 weeks for our next episode. Like, we try to always end on a positive note to let people know it's been a heavy topic that we've been discussing, but there's always that sliver of light somewhere. So I guess 2 questions. How do you strike that balance between acknowledging the severity of non-state torture and its impact on the victims? And second question, how do you inspire women to believe that there is some hope for healing for them moving forward?
Maybe what I should do is just read the definition of non-state torture. So this is a definition that evolved over time, initially from Jeanne and I, and then from other women that we've worked with and other groups. So non-state torture is a torture that occurs in the domestic or private sphere in relationships perpetrated within families, human trafficking, in prostitution, pornographic exploitation by violent groups and gangs, dismissed as social, cultural, traditional, or religious acts, and can be committed during migration, displacement, and inhumanitarian or civil unrest. The Hague Mothers are another group that are starting to send us their questionnaires, and they're ticking off the boxes too of how much torture that they've endured. And actually, we met a lawyer yesterday Jeanne was talking to, and she said that she's was working with a case where her 2 children watched her husband strangle her to unconsciousness, and then the judge gave him the children because he didn't see that really connected to the children.
Yeah.
They witnessed the torture of their mother, and yet he gave the children to the torturer. So that's another population. There's so many different kinds of non-state torture around the world. And I don't feel it's a sliver of light, in my opinion. I just feel a bright light. I really, because we know that women have worked with us and have healed. So we know that women can heal, and they can heal from extreme dissociation. So we have great hope. And I think we've always had great hope, but we didn't have the proof of the hope until we started really seeing the final results. And they can't even dissociate anymore. They would like to because they used to, because sometimes it would be comfortable for them to get away from things for a while. The frustration they have, and they kind of laugh about it, they physically cannot disassociate anymore because they're just so integrated in the everyday. That's the bright light. The earlier we have connection with women and all the women's centers around the world, if they start thinking about it that way and try to take on the methods that we've developed and helped, like the London Abuse Women's Center is doing, then the quicker young women are going to heal. They're not going to have to feel like they're going to be triggered all their lives and avoid things because they stop getting triggered as well. And then eventually we'll get into preventing, because children will be rescued from torture, non-state torture, in their early childhood. So that's my image of healing, but I'll let Jeanne go into more of the detail of it.
So you asked Andrea about her second book, and I can tell you a little bit about the story. It's one woman's story, actually. It was her husband and three other men, criminal men, who plotted to hold her captive and torture her and exploit her into prostitution. So it's her story of healing over 2 years. I mean, healing is a unique process. It depends on the age of the person, how long the person has been victimized, many things, who the perpetrators are. But for me, the first woman that came, we had to tell her we don't know how specifically to heal around the issue of torture victimization, but we will do our best. And we promise to do no harm. We'll have to move away if what we're doing doesn't help. But going into it, I never felt hopeless. Why would I start something if I felt I had no hope of healing? Like, why even say to a woman, well, I'll do this, but I really don't believe it's possible? I mean, that seems to be a contradiction.
Yeah.
So it was the idea of saying, if you don't have hope, we have hope, because we wouldn't be doing this if we didn't. Lean on our hope. We have hope. We'll share it with you. There's also the belief in healability, and probably some of that comes from my own experience. If you've been victimized and you heal, then I guess you develop a belief system that it's possible. So you can share that. You have to believe in yourself and your willingness to heal, because it is hard work. It's not easy work. Whether it's abuse or torture, it's not going to be easy. And it's a commitment too. It was a commitment for Linda and I. And for us, I have to define the experiences that I guess I would say that Linda and I were privileged in some way, because we weren't part of the system. We were independent. So we could use our nursing skills and kept assessing what we were doing as interventions to see if the progress was occurring. The average we learned very quickly was 2 hours at least, sometimes 4 hours, and sometimes 7 hours for a woman to process a memory emotionally and physically, psychologically, and come out the other side knowing, yes, I've done this and this is all I want to do. I'm good. I'm okay. So we had that privilege to do that. We were independent. We were, even though we were funding ourselves, we were still independent to do that. So the system around healing, to me, is the question, are we offering the right care? If you're not offering the right care, then we pathologize the women. We overdrug them. We call them crazy. We put them in mental institutions. We let the perpetrators say, if you're a little girl, they go to the school and they give 1,000 reasons why, as a little girl, you're acting like you're acting, because either you've got a mental health issue or you didn't take your pills. The psychiatrist ordered the pills, but you don't want to take them. Whatever the perpetrators, here again, it's the MO of the perpetrators that you have to
Or
show.
you're disordered.
Or you're
That's a big one.
disordered.
PTSD, disordered,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
So we had that capacity not to fall into the system. I know that was a gift for us and for the women too, because we followed the process. If they needed 2 hours, if they needed 4 hours, if they needed 7 hours, we did the time with them and we looked for the ending. And that even happened even on the telephone, because some of the women were not even in Canada. So we did it through the internet in different ways. And we also created interventions that were working, because the women were telling us, if you're getting better or not. If you're healing or you're not. It's a relationship issue. You brought in, when you introduced us, Andrea, that it was relational feminism. It's the relationship between the person you're helping and yourself, of equality. You have knowledge about how you survived. You have knowledge about your survival skills. You have knowledge about how you kept your life moving forward. Those are all ways to give yourself credit. Yes, that I had skills. I'm not totally powerless in this. I've survived this. So how do you work together relationally? So some of the things we did were inventive, I guess, in some ways, like for women who were tortured as young children. One of the things we learned is that they felt that they wanted to rewrite how their memory ended. So if I was 7 years old and I was trapped with these 5 men in this room, and that's how the memory ended, I was always victimized. What we created was a story of how to rewrite the ending in a way that fit. And often it's like reading a child's story. So you're 7 years old, you might be 50, but you know that the memory feels like you're 7 years old. And that's how the emotion is. You have the terror there, you have the captivity there, you have the powerlessness there. So once the story, the memory, and the emotion was worked through, and the woman knew, she said, yes, that's everything that I remember, that's everything that I felt, but I want to rewrite the ending. So we make a story, like a magic carpet would fly in, and she'd jump on the magic carpet, and we'd wrap her up in warm clothing because she was naked. But we also had a little humor with some revenge. We'd say, okay, all these perpetrators are now stuck to the wall, and they're going to just decay there.
Carbon monoxide poisoning in the room, right?
And we're off, So that was always healing, because it put power back for her to rewrite the story in a way that fit for her.
Broke the captivity to
It
freedom.
broke the captivity. And it created, like we had a laugh just now about, okay, you haven't got us. You haven't won the battle. We're winning the battle here because that's the way it ended.
But that's her autonomy
That's
Yeah.
right.
and
That's right.
empowerment.
That's
That's
right.
self-empowerment. Yes.
It's a relational issue.
Mission.
What works,
Yes.
if it didn't work, then we do something else. But we wrote that in the first book, Women in Silence, because a lot of the women were tortured from infancy. If you're born into a family that are torture traffickers, I mean, that's just the reality.
Would be the same for a woman
Yeah.
in prostitution,
Yeah.
to create an exit out of that room, how you could walk away with your personhood back.
Yeah.
It's the same idea.
Yeah.
You can work with anyone.
It's good. Well, I think, there's so much more to say about this. We've already gone almost, over an hour, and we could just keep going because this is just such a fascinating topic. As heavy as it is, it's fascinating, and it's also, I think, invigorating and affirming to people who have experienced it. Hear things like what you just said, Jeanne, about that there is a way to move forward, and there's a way to unpack this and make sense of it. And I really want to give you guys both credit for being, the trailblazers in this area to bring this term forward, this work forward, the theory of it, to really help people to make sense of things that they've gone through that don't fit those classic definitions of abuse or assault and the limitations that we have, for example, in Canada in our criminal code. So, hats off to you both, because I really think you're both, just like I said in the introduction, like tireless warriors that, just never stop. I swear,
Yes.
Linda keeps me updated on everything going on. These two women here, listeners, they have ears to the ground for everything and are just doing great work. So, really deep appreciation for you both. Obviously, anyone who's listening to this, if this is something that resonates with you, definitely reach out to Jeanne and Linda, and you can find them on their website at
www.nonstatetorture.org.
That's right. Yeah.
Yes.
And I know your questionnaire is also on the
It's on
website,
there.
so people can fill that out anonymously.
It's
as well.
under the participate section. And then if you go down in the tabs, it's questionnaires. And there's one specifically for prostitution in that section.
For family.
Or for family. And there's a whole bunch of different ones.
Human
But since we're
trafficking.
talking about prostitution in this podcast, that's why. And I just wanted to send out a sense of caring that Jeanne and I have for all women listening. Because we do. I think that's the essence of our work, is that we work tirelessly because we really do care. We care about all the women.
And I think what I'd like to say is to remember it's a positive story. When we're telling the truth, it's a positive story. We have to stop thinking it's a harmful or it hurts. It's a positive story, folks, that we're telling the truth.
Truth coming to light.
And it's so important.
Mhm.
It's so important to be authentic and to be truthful.
Mm.
And I think that's how we really ultimately connect to each other.
Mm.
And so I just want to thank you both. It's been a privilege and a real honor to sit with all of you. And Andrea, as always, it's
Mhm.
great to
Likewise.
be together and just to bring awareness to such an important topic. So I thank you all.
Thank you
Thank you
very
both.
much.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
both.
Your warriors
so much.
yourselves.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, take care, listener, and we'll see you on the next episode.
We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexposé.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexposé.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Exposé are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.